Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be ranking every game developed by Quantic Dream up to this point. And now this includes 5 games, each of which I just recently played. So my opinions of these games are pretty fresh. Now, Quantic Dream is a company that I have a lot of respect for. I mean, they were one of the first and still are pioneers in interactive storytelling in games, but I've always felt that they were held back by some pretty mixed writing and direction from their founder, president, game director, and main writer, David Cage. Now, while I do think he has some great ideas, I don't feel like he knows how to execute on those ideas. But essentially, all 5 of these games are his brainchildren, so let's get to ranking them. So we're going to start off here with number 5, and here I have the first game by Quantic Dream, and that is Omicron: The Nomad Soul. And this is definitely a big outlier out of all their games, where this is the one that tries the least to be an interactive drama. I mean, it's definitely more gamey than the other games. It feels more so like a third-person adventure game that tries to juggle around other gameplay styles as well, like first-person shooter sections, some fighting game sections. And to be honest, not all of these sections are particularly fun. I mean, narratively, this game is a mess. Mind you, that will be a trend here. While having an interesting setting of a futuristic domed city during an ice age, the actual story just goes all over the place, and by a halfway point in the story, I had no clue what was going on anymore. Another problem I have with the story here is that while the game starts off with the main character, that character eventually dies and he gets replaced with an NPC. And again, this is an interesting concept, the idea of being able to play as almost any NPC in the game. It just doesn't work from a narrative perspective, as having no main character to attach yourself to, it becomes hard to get invested in the narrative. So overall, I didn't really enjoy my time with Omicron, despite it having some really interesting concepts, especially for the year 1999. And now at number 4, I have actually the next game that they developed, and that is Indigo Prophecy, or known outside of the United States as Fahrenheit. And I found Indigo Prophecy to be a deeply flawed game, but one with good concepts. And what was really strange about it for me was to realize just how much Indigo Prophecy feels like a transitional game between Omicron and Heavy Rain. It has the supernatural elements and kind of the similar tone to something like Omicron, while having the QuickTime events, the murder mystery plotline, and the branching narrative that would appear once again in Heavy Rain. And I also noticed a lot of similarities in the dialogue, the structure, the level design. But what puts it below the later 3 games for me are, well, I mean, a few things really. I mean, the plot, again, is a mess, particularly towards the end of the game, where Lucas and Carla just all of a sudden fall in love despite only meeting like one time before. And a lot of the stuff with the Lucas plotline as a whole is just a really generic, like, chosen one sort of story. Gameplay-wise, the use of QuickTime events are ridiculous, with there being even QuickTime events during just basic conversations. The mental state mechanic is a good concept, but in execution, it just feels very arbitrary, where you're doing a lot of like random things, and then all of a sudden your mental health is going up and down based on like just the most random things. And this thing is that once your mental health goes all the way down to 0, your character dies. So overall, I still found this game to be a complete mess, though it was a bit more coherent than Omicron narratively. So I think it is better than Omicron, but not as good as the later games that they have made. Now at number 3, which numbers 2 and 3 are pretty close for me, but for number 3, I did end up picking Beyond Two Souls. And the main reason it is so close to my number 2 game is because my number 2 game is a game that I have a lot of nostalgia for. So while I do think Beyond Two Souls is a better written game, though still flawed, and does contain more gameplay than the aforementioned game, I do feel like I had to put that game a bit higher. But back to Beyond Two Souls, I do think this is a game I like more than the general gaming community. As I mentioned, I do think David Cage's writing does improve over each of his games, and this is his best to this point. But it's still deeply flawed with a lot of really poor decision making here. The biggest one being that the story was told out of order, which makes it very hard to get a grasp of the narrative, as you're always trying to remember where this chapter takes place in the overall continuity. And also because of the missions being played out of order, this leads to less of your decisions mattering, as they can't, as future scenes will sometimes be played before previous scenes. And because of that, a lot of these chapters just feel so disjointed, as most of them don't directly connect to each other. There are very few chapters that take place back to back. Now, I did play the PS4 version of the game where they did add a remix mode that allows you to play the chapters in chronological order. And the problem with that mode is that the pacing is completely off, with a lot of the later chapters like Homeless and Navajo taking so long and contributing very little to the overall narrative. But that being said, I did like the concept of the story and having the ability to play as both Jody and Aiden. I really like Jody as a character, and a lot of that comes from Ellen Page's acting. And acting in this game is pretty good, especially when compared to the games that came out before it. So overall, I do think Beyond Two Souls is probably a better game than the next game on the list, but I have more of a connection to that game, so Beyond Two Souls stays at number 3 here for me. Now at number 2, which is a game that I've been mentioning a lot, and that is Heavy Rain. And for me, Heavy Rain holds a special place in my heart, as it's a game I used to play over and over and over again at the time of its original release. I mean, I was pretty mind blown at the time at all the different scenarios within the game and how many different endings there were. It's one of the few games where a good amount of your choices actually end up mattering on how the narrative plays out. Now, if only the narrative was a bit better. I mean, this is another example of David Cage having a good concept but not being able to execute on it. The writing here is terrible. But in this game, at least it's like the so bad that it's good sort of quality. I mean, the dialogue is so ridiculous at points. The plot makes no sense. And I will be spoiling the game here, so fast forward if you don't want to get spoiled. But there's so many dumb things here. I mean, Ethan's blackouts that are obviously there as a red herring, but they're never explained. Madison being shocked learning the origami killer's identity despite having never met Scott Shelby. The entire plot twist with Scott is so dumb narratively, as the game completely contradicts it up to that point. I mean, it would be a fantastic twist if the game didn't include like inner dialogues with Scott that never implied him being the origami killer, or having moments like in the Manfred chapter where Scott is by himself being shocked that Manfred is killed, despite later in the game it's shown that Scott killed him himself. It's like, what was David Cage thinking? Like, I really don't get it. The voice acting in this game is also laughably bad as well, especially from the kids. I mean, it's really terrible. So I know I'm complaining a lot here, but Heavy Rain is a game that, while it is bad, I still think it's really innovative, especially for the time. And it's a game that I have so much of a connection to and so much actually respect for, in the sense of what it was trying to do. So I do feel like it deserves a spot here at number 2. So at number 1, which should be pretty obvious at this point, obviously, and that is Detroit Become Human. And to be honest, it's not even close. I mean, I think Detroit is easily David Cage's best work in pretty much every aspect. To me, Detroit feels like a progression of Heavy Rain, taking a good chunk of concepts from it and improving upon it, even more so than Heavy Rain. This game is a game where your decisions actually matter, and the flowcharts that they show you at the end of each chapter really demonstrate that. The acting is pretty strong from pretty much every character of note. Detroit involves more gameplay than Heavy Rain. I mean, Connor feels like a more improved version of Norman Jayden and ends up being a pretty complex character by the end of the game. And it's within his story that you get a lot of the murder mystery stuff. That, again, kind of feels like Heavy Rain. You have Kara's story, which is one that pulls on your heartstrings probably the most. And then Marx's is probably the weakest storyline of the bunch, despite it being pretty much the main storyline of the game. And probably also has the biggest weakness of the narrative as a whole, in how blatant the themes are being shoved down your throat with ridiculous moments like the Freedom March. But despite this, I do think the writing in this game, especially in the dialogue, is much stronger than the other Quantic Dream games. Connor is probably the best character David Cage has ever written. So overall, I really do love Detroit Become Human. I mean, it has its issues, but it's certainly the least flawed of all these Quantic Dream games. And it's a game that I've played multiple times and grow more respect for every time I play it. So for me, this is easily the best Quantic Dream game. So there we go. That is every Quantic Dream game and my rankings of them. It's kind of weird I'm talking so negatively about like games that are on the top of the list, but Detroit's probably the only game of this entire list I would actually consider a great game. But yeah, that's David Cage for you. So that's the video. That's everything I wanted to say. Thank you for watching.